Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Webster. I'm the founder, CEO, and CISO of Cyvergence. Today, we're going to be discussing the basics of cybersecurity risk assessments. So this is going to be the part of an ongoing series. We're also going to be discussing the future third-party cybersecurity risk, managing corporate cybersecurity risk, and we'll go into future discussions as time goes on. So what are you going to learn today? We're going to go through the definition of risk. Why is understanding risk important? The context of cybersecurity risk, the two basic types of risk assessment, how to assess likelihood and impact. So if we look at the agenda, here are the sections that we're going to cover: an introduction to risk, formalizing the risk processes, assessing likelihood, assessing impact, tying it all together, and then we're going to touch on Cyvergence risk services. So an introduction to risk. So for those who may not be aware, NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They are heavily involved in cybersecurity on a regular basis, including a lot of frameworks and so on. But they have a very good definition of cybersecurity risk, which is probably not a bad place to start in terms of understanding the risk. So they write, an effect of uncertainty on or within information and technology. Cybersecurity risks relate to the loss of confidentiality, integrity or availability of information, data or information or control of systems, and reflect the potential adverse impacts to organizational operations, i.e. mission functions, image or reputation, and assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation. So this is a very broad definition of risk, but encompasses most of the key things that cybersecurity professionals need to focus on. CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability are the cornerstones and the foundation for understanding what the risk is. And it also covers, a lot of the operational situations, image and reputation. So all of these things are very foundational to understanding risk across the board. So why are understanding risk assessments important, and why are performing these risk assessments important? To me, risk assessments are the foundation of good governance. It gets everybody to think about risk and what they're doing. It also develops a common language. Like if you say high risk, what does that mean? What is a moderate risk or a minimal risk? All of these things, it gives a more clear idea about what that actually means. It helps the company look beyond the compliance-only mindset. There are some companies today who believe if we're compliant, we're secure, and that just isn't necessarily the case. So you have to look at things. Further, there's no such thing as black or white. You can only reduce risk and not completely eliminate it. So if you reduce risk down to a minimal level, you're probably doing okay by organizational definitions. Oftentimes, risk assessments are part of compliance. So if you're not doing a risk assessment, you may not be compliant, so that needs to be done anyway. For me, also, another thing is that it's a starting point for discussing prioritization, say, of IT operations or DevSecOps, and where does security fit into that big picture? If you include the risk assessment and you take a look at that process, that's a really good thing to note. So this next slide comes from the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report for 2023. If you go up to the upper right-hand corner, those are the more severe risks, the long-term risks and the short-term risks. For most companies, you're seeing things like failure to mitigate climate change, failure of climate change adaptation, natural disasters, and extreme weather. For most companies, that isn't the most important thing. For some, it may be. But for many organizations, one of the largest risks that you're dealing with here is widespread cybercrime and cyber insecurity. Now, again, there's going to be exceptions, but cybercrime is going to be the greatest impact for many organizations. So just take that in. So it also gives you a reason why cybersecurity is so important. Let's jump into formalizing the risk process. A good thing to ask yourself before you get started, why are you performing the risk assessment? Are you aligning with the business in the process of performing that risk assessment? What are the different requirements? And this could be fed in from compliance or other sources. And the depth that's appropriate for your organization. There's a lot of different approaches that you can go with here. Determining a risk framework is a good place to get started. I like to examine what currently exists in the organization. Do you have something called enterprise risk management, which we'll touch on later? maybe if that already exists, you want to follow with whatever they have, because the goal of risk assessments is usually to communicate with the business in a clear and understandable way that makes sense. Also, if you're defining it for the very first time, talk to the business, provide examples of risk assessments to figure out what framework is going to best communicate with them. Now, there's a couple of types of risk assessment. There's qualitative or quantitative risk assessments. We're going to touch on the details of those. But one of the questions that I'm asked over and over again is, what's the best framework? And the reality is you have to meet your regulatory or compliance requirements, but you also want to meet the business. You want to communicate with the business owners. That's part of the reason for doing this. And a lot of people think, well, it's either qualitative or quantitative. You can blend the two, and there's lots of different ways of blending the two to have it make more sense to the business owners. So this is, part of that maturation process. So let's take a look at a qualitative risk format. If we look over on the left-hand side, you see likelihood, and you see below that minimal, low, moderate, high, and very high. It's always good to ascribe a definition to each one of those. A minimal likelihood could be anything that's greater than 5 years. It could be 10 years. Very high could be more than once a day, or maybe it's 100,000 times a day. You could go on and on with different definitions, but it gives you, it gets a general sense for how often something is going to occur. And then you've got impact. There's minimal, low, moderate, high, and critical. A critical impact, it's good to define because that might be your business has the likelihood of going out of business, as a result of whatever happens. A lot of small businesses that go through this, these are the types of things that they face. Minimal, it's something that's kind of noted in the background, but nobody really cares about. That might be a minimal risk. But you need to sit down and really define one of those and make sure that the business is on board with defining these things in order to move forward from a qualitative standpoint. You can also use very general terms. Just think, well, here's my guess being a practitioner, and here's how we're going to approach it. When you look at the dark green, light green, yellow, orange, and red, that's where the risk is. So what you're doing is you're mapping the impact and likelihood. So let's say the impact is critical, but the likelihood is minimal. You go across and you see where the two map up on there, and you're going to see that the risk for that particular situation is low. So if it doesn't occur once every 10 years, that's going to be considered low risk by most organizations. But a lot of the stuff is going to depend, as we're going to see in the next slide. So let's go into a quantitative risk formula example. We've got single loss expectancy. This is the total cost, usually in the dollar value. It could be different depending on the country that you're in, but the single loss expectancy of a particular event. So let's say that event is $10 million. But the annualized rate of occurrence is going to be once out of 10 years, something like that will occur. So that $10 million becomes an annualized loss expectancy of $1 million. So it may make financial sense in many organizations to go through and say, we've got a $1 million per year risk. Can we invest in a $100,000 program in order to protect against that annualized loss expectancy? And it may make financial sense. So that's the advantage when you get into a quantitative risk assessment. It's something called cyber risk quantification when you're doing these types of things. So there's a lot of different approaches that you can take related to this. There's also the FAIR model. There are lots of other models that are on the market, but it's considered the de facto standard in terms of a quantitative methodology. So you can see here, you've got on the left-hand side, you've got the loss event frequency. In other words, how often is it going to occur? Then you've got the loss magnitude. And this is where you provide some additional details. What is the company's resistance strength? Can we resist at 90%? Can we resist at 10%? Whatever that story is, you could put that in there. And then underneath that, you've got the threat capability. How strong is that threat compared to the resistance of the company? And that's a really big factor to take into account. There's threat event frequency, the contact frequency versus the probability of action, and trying to put all these things together. There's loss magnitude, the primary loss versus the secondary loss. So let's say we're dealing with a website, and if it goes down for an hour, that's going to be a loss of $2 million. Well, you know what? That's only part of it. What if it goes down and there's ransomware and you decide to pay within that? It's going to be $2 million, but there's additional factors that are going to go into that. And then you get the secondary risk. Maybe your customers don't trust you because you decided to pay a ransom. Maybe you ended up paying it to somebody you shouldn't have been paying to. And so there's a lot of factors that go into taking a look at FAIR. But if you're really interested in diving into the details, FAIR is a good place to get started. So let's get into assessing likelihood. We're going to look at both internal and external data sources to try to figure out how do they play into things. And for me, I'm going to go left to right on this. Looking at governance is a good way to go. What are your processes that you work from? Do you have approvals for how things are going to take place? Are you going to do that as part of your change control? Do you have a process in place? Does an outside perspective, such as security, take the additional step of trying to do everything? And that's really important to do that quality assurance. For some organizations, they're going to do that. Others not. You might define specific cases where that's true and other cases where it's not true. For example, I've seen one case where a dot was left out, a period was left out of some programming, and it just needed to be changed. I don't know that you need to go that far and have security approve that level of change. But, again, it depends on the organization because it may have major impacts on an organization. So just take into account, what is the likelihood and what's the impact of the organization so you can be as careful as possible. The greater the impact to the organization, the more important that risk can be. I like to look at risk documents if they exist in the organization. So enterprise risk management, some of these other things, just to get a better sense of what are the data sources. What are the legal rulings that have taken place? How do they look at cybersecurity? What are the key things that they're interested in that could affect the overall outcome or impact or likelihood related to a risk? How often are they occurring? They can provide some of that information. There's compliance as well. Not all compliance models are the same. Some people want to use the NIST CSF cybersecurity framework as a compliance model, and it's not a bad place to start. But there's a difference between being mature from the NIST cybersecurity perspective and being mature, say, from an 853 perspective. Now, there are advocates and detractors of each of the different methodologies, but it's just something to take into account. There's architecture. I'm going to tell you that I have seen web servers that are external to the firewall. It may seem crazy for those of you who really understand things, but for those who do not understand my statement, it means that the entire internet then has access to that web server. So you've got to look at the architecture and understand how is it set up, where are the key resources, how do they fit into everything, and really start to go into a lot of the details to make sure that resources are protected appropriately. There's a lot that can go into it. That's just a very simple example, but network and security architecture is a big part of understanding the overall controls and protection within an organization. There's threat and vulnerability. So those who are familiar with things like penetration tests or vulnerability assessments or things like that, what are you doing? Are you doing this on a quarterly basis? Do you do this on a daily basis, and the threat and vulnerability teams are just going back and forth, always working towards remediation? Or is there another approach that you're taking? There's incident response. Do you have an incident response plan if something goes wrong? We hope it doesn't, but maybe that's a factor. For the incidents, what's the mean time to resolve those incidents? So that's another factor that can go into it and try to tell you, well, how likely are these incidents to occur? You take a look at the past events that have taken place, and then you start to factor in to create a bigger story for how often events are going to happen. Identity is a really big consideration as well. Do you have rogue accounts going on? Do you have strong protection on the administrative controls that are in place? These are just additional factors that are part of the whole identity process. Configuration management is another key thing as well. You can do basic configurations. Vulnerability management, for example, typically has some sort of configuration requirements that are going into it. They say, this is bad if you don't fix it, but it's far from complete. There are other models out there, like the Center for Internet Security, for example, has its own hardening standards. There's SCAP, your Content Automation Protocol, more used in the US federal space than some of the other spaces. There are other types of configuration requirements as well that can be set for an organization. So understanding the types of configurations can help you to determine what is the overall likelihood of something taking place. And it also can help determine, when you're going through this process, what is the impact going to be. So this can serve as information for both. But let's go ahead and move to external data sources. Over here on the right-hand side, you're seeing a section from the 2023 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. This is for incidents, and it tells you some information, but trying to pull from different places like TrustWave or Mandiant, etc., all can have impact on how you're going to view the risk. So where are the greatest risks? Over on the left-hand side column within figure 50 there, it's the accommodations. You can see at the top, it goes from pattern, below that is action, below that is asset. So if you look at the assets more clearly, you can typically see that the servers typically are what's compromised in an incident situation. There's hacking as well. How often are systems hacked? That's under action. So you have to sit down and take a look at the data and see what goes on. And this gives a much clearer picture for an organization. But it's, again, you want to look at your own data too to try to blend a lot of this stuff together. So what you need to do is you need to factor in both the external sources, the internal sources, to try to determine what that likelihood is. So it should be noted, and this is something a lot of security practitioners do not like to admit, but cybersecurity risk is not a perfect actuarial science. If you collect all of the data about what's your network infrastructure look like, what's your IoT landscape look like, and how does all this stuff fit together? What kind of controls do you have in place? What kind of network segmentation? There's all these different things that play into that to determine what really is the likelihood of something taking place. The likelihood is only part of the process. Determining the impact is also important because you can't just determine that on your own. You need to look at some stuff. So in the worst case scenario, it's always good to look at the news. What's going on. Take a look at some existing breaches. There's a lot of places you can go to pull that information. Take a look at legal cases. Sometimes they're going to be enlightening to find out exactly what happened. What are the key things? The Security Exchange Commissions does have Form 8K that's out there that provides some additional information about how is the Security Exchange Commission looking at these things. Cyber insurance is also another good place to estimate the overarching cost of a black swan event. It's not a bad place to get started. Now, there's a lot that has to be done when you're starting to look at some other internal risks, but it's not a bad place to look from a black swan perspective, which we're jumping into right now. So a black swan event is the worst case possible scenario related to an organization. This could be like total ransomware throughout the organization. They pay money and everything's got to be built from scratch, which a lot of people think, oh, that'll never happen. The likelihoods are low, but it depends. There are organizations that have paid, one that I'm thinking of right now, paid $40 million for getting rid of ransomware, getting them to get rid, turn off their ransomware, but when you look at things, start to explain some of the details behind it. There's data exfiltration. This is in the case of a breach. Then you have ransomware. This is the actual, hey, we're locking up your system so you can't gain access to us until you pay the ransom and we give you the code in order to get in. But then there's related extortion to ransomware. This is, hey, we stole your data and then we locked your system up. Hey, here's an example of our data. Do you want us to go sell that data? And then that puts additional pressure on the companies that have to face the extortion. So in those particular cases, what do you do? And that's where you run into some challenges. Some are going to pay the ransom, some won't. But if that isn't enough, if they find that you're doing business with somebody else and they say, we've got company A, the data from company A, how are they going to respond to that? So if they've got that data, they're going to use that to go to your business partners to say, we're going to sell your data unless they pay. You should get them to pay. And then you've got to sit down and respond to those types of ransoms, that type of extortion. And then, of course, there's denial of service. So on top of all this, they can throw a denial of service attack against you to make it look like you're still down, or you have to pay the related extortion. Now, each company has different levels of protection or concerns when it comes to these types of things. So it's just something that has to be taken into account. but when you're listing the black swan impacts, other things are you have to build your entire infrastructure from scratch. As we saw with the Ukraine war, there's a new type of malware called wiperware. It just simply wipe out the whole system. And what do you do in that particular case? Well, not much. You're close to breaking the individual systems and having to build them. There's supply chain disruptions, reputational impacts to consider, loss of business, stock price volatility, liability, regulatory fines. All of these things can affect organizations. In worst case scenario, some of these companies may actually go out of business. We hope it never happens, but the reality is it has happened. Other impact considerations, when you're starting to get a little bit more granular than that really broad brushstroke of the worst case scenario, take a look at the data. What are your data governance practices? What are the risks that are related to that? Where is the data? How much data is it? Is the data encrypted? Provide some additional cybersecurity controls related to that. Say, what are the risks that you're taking into account? Understand the business. What are the loss? Do you have a business impact assessment that's going on within an organization? What does that business impact assessment say? So then you've got analyzing all the other details, all the stuff that we spoke about previously, tie in here, and you can use that to make a better business case to really more appropriately assess what the impact is related to a risk. So let's tie it all together. Now, obviously, you can go with external risk assessments or internal risk assessments. In some cases, some are more appropriate than the other. It kind of depends on the context, the expertise, and a lot of other factors that need to be looked at within an organization. The external provides an outside perspective. It provides a comparison to other companies. It may use different methodologies, or it may improve on some things. It's always good to get a different perspective because they're going to see things from an external perspective that probably you did not see from an internal perspective. Another thing is, and this is true for any type of consultant that you bring in, senior management tends to listen with a little bit different ear. Even if they're paying you more than they would for the assessment, they're going to take a different perspective when performing that risk assessment. So there's a lot of reasons why you would want to work with an external risk assessment over an internal. But that being said, if you've already established a standardized program of risk, either A, you can educate the consultants on that, and then they can use that, or B, you can just take whatever they come out with and say, I'm going to work with my own standard. There's deeper assessments that can be done. There's formalized risk frameworks that can be used. And typically speaking, the internal people can do a much greater granular control than what you'd be able to do otherwise. So that's very important when considering the external versus internal. Internal does have a place, and so does external. It all depends on what level of maturity you're at and a bunch of other factors. So there's a lot of different approaches to risk assessments. A lot of companies, like Cyvergence, we have our own standardized methodology, but we can use, pretty much any of the frameworks that are out here. There's relevant industry regulations, privacy, et cetera, things to look at. You can do examinations of the various programs and technologies. How are they being utilized? Take a look at the maturity related to the technology of the program. There's a lot of things that you can do. You can always look at new risks or identified or recognized risks. But it's also really good to right-size the risk assessment process to the audience. If you get very detail-oriented, the business may not understand all the specifics. So you've got to be, make sure that you're at the right level if you're trying to communicate with the business to make sure that they're aware of what that actually means. So getting to that point, though, this is something that can be a little tricky. These are just a few examples out of them, but there's a lot that you can go into and dive into a little bit greater granularity or less, depending on the organization. You can look at the business risks, things like loss of business, regulatory risks, reputational risks. There's all kinds of things that you can tie into this stuff, but usually the business risks need to be tied into something else. The programmatic risk, you might say poor cyber hygiene. I'm being very generic here. That can mean so many different things to so many different people. For example, some people I know look at identity and say that if you're not really managing your identities in a clear way, they're going to define that as cyber hygiene. Others are going to say, nope, it's all about your configurations and your patching and vulnerability management. And if you've got that covered, that's your definition of cyber hygiene. So there's a lot of things that can go into this, and some of this is going to be dependent upon the organization to figure out the right level of detail. But then you can get down to very specific types of attacks or specific scenarios, like a compromised system. This could be data exfiltration, or the system is compromised, or unauthorized access. There's all kinds of things that you can start to dive into when looking at this. For those who are familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, some people really like to dive into that. It requires a lot more knowledge and a lot greater detail in order to dive into that. And you really do need the appropriate level of tools to go into that MITRE ATT&CK framework, and the reality is, if you're doing that, it might resonate really well with your IT staff or the different security staff, but that doesn't mean that it's always going to resonate well with the business. So you have to be very careful in that communication when you're looking at the overall risk assessment. Some other details that you might want to consider here is something like CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, that we looked at for the definition. When we look at CIA, like organizations that have to follow HIPAA should have a CIA assessment in the risk assessment that they're performing. Their scope, what is the scope that you want to take a look at here? Sometimes compliance is broken down into different areas, and there's different amounts of data going through different areas. So the same data might be at level 1 risk in one place and a level 2 risk at someplace else. And I'm being very generic here, but you get the gist of what I'm trying to say. Materiality, do you have a functional deficiency in your organization which could affect risk? And if those are the types of cases that you're dealing with, this is something that you really need to focus on. There's owner, who is the risk owner across the board? So those are other things to consider when you're looking at risks for organizations. A lot of times people ask, when should you perform a risk assessment? And the reality is, it just depends. A lot of compliance models say you've got to do it yearly. A lot of governance is going to say, well, you have to do it at least yearly. But there's major system changes. If you get something major changing, or you're bringing in systems that have never existed before, doing a risk assessment might make sense. You might take a look at the previous environment versus the new environment, and figure out what that process is going to look like. There's third-party risk assessments. So whenever you work with a third party, not whenever, because there's context when you would not necessarily want to do a third-party assessment. If somebody's walking into your store, they've got a company credit card and they swipe it, you probably don't need a third-party risk assessment for those particular situations. But in general, if you're bringing in somebody, especially if you've got access to data or access to sensitive systems, you probably want to do a third-party risk assessment. Again, if you are aware of any deficiencies, material weaknesses, you really should reassess your controls. Even if you've done a control assessment 3 months ago, and all of a sudden you discover a major deficiency you didn't know about before, well, maybe you need to change your overall risk assessment within your organization. So these are just a few other factors to take into account when performing risk assessments. But to me, the most important thing that you can do is start to report. Creating a prioritized list, following standardized practices. You can use outside practices or inside practices, but ask also what works with your technology. We're not going to go into this in depth today, but a lot of governance, risk, and compliance, GRC solutions, you tie the risks into it. And that's part of the point behind it, but they might have limited ways of reporting risks. And so you might have to work within their methodology in order to get the GRC solution working properly. But the other thing to consider is what speaks to your senior management. Are they on board with the communication methods? These are just a few things to consider. So there's creating written reports. To me, they have much greater impact. The words are the wind. So if you don't actually do anything more than say, yep, we got a risk, and then you do nothing about it, you know what, who cares? That's just the wind blowing, and everybody's going to forget about it, and it's not going to be considered very important. But it's going to have an impact. If you have written and say, look, you have got a material risk, you've got a critical risk of, say, $10 million, you know what, that's going to have a lot of impact on people. Even if you state it should have some impact, but you write it, now somebody has to become accountable and start to do something about it. So that written reports create that additional level of accountability, like, hey, can we do something about that? So defining some of those ideas within the organization is very helpful. There's auditability and traceability and alignment when you're looking with the written reports. And also, like, it's okay for the assessor to be wrong, and you submit it and say, hey, here's my assessment of your risk. They might go through and say, you know what, this might be a little bit higher, this might be a little bit lower. And it happens all the time. There are things that people don't know about. And then you just have to say, oh, fantastic, I didn't know about it. Thank you very much. Let's move forward. How do you do it? There's executive summaries. I think they're very important because you want the executives to be able to read this, understand it, digest it, and get something out of it from a high level. When you look at things like the scope is very important. Like maybe you're looking at it from a tiny scope perspective of just the data center. But I know organizations I've assessed that they've got a decent data center, but then they're putting things on personal computers. And if you're putting on a personal computer, that's not really carefully looking at the whole scope, especially if you're putting data on a personal computer. It may sound crazy, but there are some organizations who work like that. Some people might put this out into something called a risk register. We'll cover that in a later session. That's important. But going back to maturity as well, sign off is very important. If the business owner signs off on it, that is a very good sense of the business owner taking responsibility and understanding what the risks are and how this is taking place. So these are just a few things to take into account when you're creating this written report. You want to write down all of those risks. How did you come to that conclusion? What are the details behind it, and so on? All right, so now we're going to get to Cyvergence risk services. There are a bunch of things that we can do. We can do risk assessments for you. We can break this out in a variety of different ways, different levels of maturity. We can pick different frameworks. All of these things can be taken into account. There's risk register building. If you need a risk register, you want to build a whole program around risk management, that's something we can help you with. There's third-party risk, mergers and acquisitions. If you're acquiring a new company, well, what is risk to it? You maybe want to assess how much risk am I taking on as a result of this company. There's a GRC that I mentioned earlier, which also referred to as integrated risk management solutions. There's a lot of things that we can help with. Anything that you need, definitely feel free to reach out to us and we'll go from there. So I want to thank everybody for their time today. If you like this presentation, hit like, so you can watch more presentations in the future. Follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook. And also we're available at www.cyvergence.biz. Look forward to hearing from everybody in the near future, and thank you very much for attending. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.